Listen close, honey, because I'm about to tell you a story about hope. But you know how hope is in this life. It's always built on a foundation of shifting sand, ready to crumble the minute you lean too hard on it. This story, it starts right here, in this dusty, forgotten little town that suddenly got a shot at the big time, all because of a promise. A promise as tall and shining as the rising steel of the new Harrison Medical Center. We're talking about Elena Martinez, 38 years old, tough as leather and beautiful like a quiet Sunday morning. She was a widow, a single mother, who carried grief like a third shadow. Her man, Marcos, died years back in a horrible accident at a construction site, and Elena always knew, deep down in her bones, that the powerful folks had just swept the whole thing right under the rug. Justice? Honey, that word didn't exist in Elena's vocabulary. She kept her dignity serving coffee at Murphy's Diner, but lately things had changed. Mr. James Harrison, the big city CEO, had come to town, offering salvation in the form of jobs and scholarships. Now, Elena split her time, wearing two masks, the corporate one for Harrison Enterprises as the community liaison, and the Waitress one at night. But here's the secret nobody knew. All those double shifts, all those years of lifting trays and holding her world together, had left her with a constant, searing pain running down her arm. She hid it every day, because losing this new job meant losing everything, and she couldn't risk the future she'd just fought so hard to grab. And that future? That was her daughter, Maya, 18 years old, and bright enough to light up the whole town. Maya was finally living the dream, studying nursing on Harrison's dime. But that dream was a nightmare of pressure. She felt the weight of her mama's sacrifice every single second, and she was terrified of failing. Maya's secret? She was drowning. To keep up the immaculate grades, to meet the impossible demands of her schedule, she was relying on unregulated pills and so much caffeine she was practically vibrating out of her skin. She was burning out, pushing herself right to the edge of failure. But she couldn't tell Elena. They had already sacrificed too much. Now, James Harrison, the savior. He was 42, handsome, and trying hard to outrun the legacy of his daddy, who built that empire on greed. James was truly trying to do good, but bless his heart, he was naive. He thought he could just build a shining hospital and wash away the sins of the past. He didn't realize how much corruption was still festering deep inside his own company, waiting to betray him. And then there was the shadow, Victor Sterling, 55, mean as a snake, and obsessed with ripping the town apart for profit. He was the devil hiding in plain sight, a rival real estate magnate who saw Harrison's good deed as a weakness to exploit. He had deep, filthy ties to the town's past, ties that wrapped right around the death of Marcos Martinez. Victor was Elena's silent enemy, the one she didn't even know was watching. For 3 whole months, they all lived in a fragile bubble. 3 months of warm dinners, good grades, and the hopeful sound of hammers building a future. But you know how it is when you sweep dirt under the rug? It just piles up until the whole floor gives way. The foundation was cracked before the first brick was laid, and the clock was ticking down to the moment when their newfound peace would not just end, but shatter into a million pieces. You just wait. That big, beautiful medical center? It was about to become the site of a horrifying accident that would drag Marcos's grave right back into the daylight. And the quiet hope that sustained them was about to be buried deep beneath a crushing pile of concrete and lies. 3 months of fragile peace were violently replaced by 3 days of harrowing dread. The sight of the crumpled scaffolding and the sound of the emergency sirens replayed constantly in Elena Martinez's mind. each reel dragging her 13 years back, forcing her to relive the slow, agonizing realization that her husband, Marcos, was gone because someone had valued profit over human life. The constant pressure of the crisis management role, interfacing with the distraught families, reassuring the community, fielding invasive media questions, was an effective anesthetic, distracting her from the deeper pain. But when she returned to her quiet apartment, the distraction dissolved, leaving her only with the cold, hard weight of the investigation she had secretly begun. Her first step was securing details on the injured worker, Javier Rivas, the man who had whispered Marcos's name. Using her access as community liaison, she visited him at the hospital under the guise of an official Harrison Enterprises welfare check. Javier, immobilized and heavily medicated, was reluctant to speak openly, fearing corporate retaliation that could cost him his future settlements. "They'll blame the crew, Elena. They always do," he whispered, his eyes scanning the door, terrified of a lurking auditor. "But I saw the delivery manifests. They switched the primary concrete supplier 3 weeks ago. It was a firm called Horizon Pours. They're small, cheap, and fast." Elena thanked him and left, the name Horizon Pours etching itself into her memory. She didn't return to the hospital. She returned to the dusty, scentless box she had excavated the night of the collapse, the box containing Marcos' final documents. The task of sifting through the reports was physically grueling. Every time she lifted the heavy manila folder detailing Marcos's compensation claim and the resulting police reports, a sharp, white-hot agony flared in her left forearm, running from her wrist to her elbow. This chronic injury, a byproduct of years spent waitressing double shifts at Murphy's and a long-forgotten factory job before that, usually only offered a dull ache. Now, under the stress of resurrected trauma, it screamed in protest, demanding to be acknowledged. She swallowed pain relievers like candy, determined to keep the pain and her secret from impacting her ability to work or investigate. She found it on the third night, buried deep in a supplementary police file from 13 years ago, a list of subsidiaries and shell companies linked to the firm initially investigated for negligence in Marcos's death. The primary name had been North Star Aggregates. Under a complex, outdated corporate registry schematic, she found the damning connection. Horizon Pours was listed as a minor, 90% owned subsidiary of North Star Aggregates, a company that had been fined, dissolved, and then quietly reformed under new ownership, yet retained the same operational structure and, crucially, the same tendency to cut corners on material quality. The shock hit her with paralyzing force. James Harrison, the man she had learned to trust, the benefactor who held her daughter's entire future in his hands, was using the same network of corruption that had destroyed her life a decade prior. It was too vast, too intricate a connection to be coincidence. Elena's suspicion congealed into certainty. James was not a savior. He was simply a more polished version of the corporate greed that had killed her husband. This belief overshadowed everything else. When Maya came home late one evening, exhausted and jittery from a pre-dawn clinical rotation followed by 10 straight hours of classes, Elena barely registered her daughter's pallor. "I aced my pharmacology quiz, Mom," Maya announced, forcing a tired smile. "That's wonderful, Mia," Elena replied absently, tapping a pencil against the damning list of subcontractors. She didn't see the dark circles beneath Maya's eyes, the slight, involuntary tremor in her hands, or the unnerving energy that seemed to be fueled less by sleep and more by sheer chemical desperation. Maya had convinced herself that the pressure was a necessary evil, drinking quadruple espresso shots and occasionally resorting to the unregulated focus-enhancing pills whispered about in the study rooms to keep her impossible schedule. She was terrified that if she slipped even once, the Harrison Scholarship and everything her mother had fought for would vanish. Elena was too consumed by the rot she had uncovered to notice the fragility festering right beneath her own roof. Armed with her proof, Elena marched into James Harrison's office the following morning. She bypassed his assistant, her face a mask of cold resolve, her arm throbbing fiercely as if mirroring the structural instability of the tower itself. James was on the phone, visibly stressed, pacing before the panoramic window overlooking the disaster site. He hung up immediately upon seeing Elena's face. "Elena, what is it? The insurance adjusters are proving impossible, and the local press is circling like vultures." "It's the subcontractors, James," Elena said, placing the worn, decade-old document detailing North Star aggregates next to the pristine current manifest for Horizon Pours. Horizon Pours is a shell. They are a direct extension of the company that caused Marcos Martinez's death 13 years ago due to substandard concrete. This collapse is not a fluke. It is history repeating itself, James. And you brought them here. James stared at the documents, his face draining of color. He didn't look like a liar. He looked like a man punched violently in the gut. That is impossible," he stammered, pulling off his tie. "My procurement team runs exhaustive background checks. We use third-party vendors for material quality control. I ordered zero tolerance on anything related to negligence." "Did you, James? Or did you just order cheap, fast concrete?" Elena countered, her voice dangerously quiet. "Tell me the truth. Were you so desperate to hit your midpoint deadline that you ignored the risks? Or are you actively concealing the fact that your father's legacy is built on the same deceitful foundation as Victor Sterling's entire career?" The mention of Sterling, a name Elena barely knew but had seen referenced in some of the older political documents surrounding Marcos' case, seemed to hit James harder than the accusation of negligence. "Victor Sterling has nothing to do with this, Elena," James insisted, though his eyes darted away momentarily. "And I swear to you, I knew nothing about this legacy connection. My father, yes, he made many regrettable alliances, but my focus is redemption. If this is true, my procurement chief will be fired and prosecuted today." "Fired or covered up, James? Which is it?" Elena knew, in that gut-wrenching moment, that James Harrison was not the evil architect she had feared. He was something worse, naive. He was a generous man who believed his money and his good intentions could cleanse the decades of rot built into the very fabric of his corporation. He was a man who still trusted the wolves he had inherited. Defeated, Elena turned to leave. She had asked for the truth and received corporate denial and stunned indignation. It did not matter if James was ignorant or complicit. The end result was the same. Marcos was still dead, and now more workers were injured because of Harrison Enterprises' failure to truly reform. "I'll have the records of the structural investigation on your desk by dawn, Elena," James called out, his voice now ragged. "I am going to tear this company apart until I find the failure point." Elena merely nodded, stepping out of the cool, marble-lined executive corridor. She moved past the reception desk and down the hall toward the elevator. It was here, rounding the corner near the executive security office, that the final, devastating piece of the puzzle slid into place, shattering the entire narrative of corporate negligence. A young security analyst, visibly panicked, was talking into a private phone line, his voice a tight, frantic whisper. He didn't notice Elena pause behind a potted fern. "It wasn't the mix, sir. The core samples are back. The concrete was sound, but it was compromised. It was too clean. Not a structural defect, but a shear fracture. It was a pressure charge. Someone engineered the collapse, sir. They blew the support beam from the inside. Elena felt the blood freeze in her veins. This wasn't negligence. This was malice. This was sabotage. She suddenly understood James's strange reaction when she had mentioned Victor Sterling. He wasn't afraid of the name because of his father's past. He was afraid of the name because Victor Sterling was actively trying to destroy the medical center now. As Elena stood frozen, the security analyst ended his call and frantically began shredding a series of large, glossy photographs. Even from a distance, Elena could recognize the distinctive, arrogant profile of the man in the pictures. The analyst was shredding photographs of James Harrison's chief rival, the ruthless real estate magnate. The analyst was destroying evidence of Victor Sterling meeting late at night, not with James Harrison's rivals, but with James Harrison's chief operating officer right near the construction site just hours before the foundation collapsed. The realization hit Elena like a physical blow, worse than the chronic pain currently searing her arm. James Harrison was completely vulnerable, being undermined and betrayed from within his own organization, while the man who had caused Marcos's death 13 years ago, Victor Sterling, was now actively engineering the final lethal blow to James's project, using James's own executive team as a weapon. Elena had targeted the wrong man, and now both of their lives and Maya's future were hanging by a thread stretched taut between corporate betrayal and deliberate, vengeful destruction. She had to get to James. But first, she had to ensure the evidence she had just witnessed wasn't completely destroyed. She glanced down the hall. The analyst was still focused on the shredder. Elena knew she had seconds. Her heart pounded a frantic rhythm, but her mind was fiercely focused. She quietly slipped away from the executive corridor, adrenaline overriding the searing pain in her arm. Where was the nearest fire escape? She was determined to retrieve those shredded documents, even if it meant risking her job, her freedom, and the entire fragile future she had built. She had to expose the real enemy. The immediate aftermath of the collapse was a deafening, terrifying silence, punctuated only by the urgent static of police radios and the rhythmic throb of Elena Martinez's own guilt. She was the community liaison, the supposed bridge between Harrison Enterprises and the frightened, injured people of the town. Yet, she was also a detective fueled by 13 years of suppressed sorrow, working against the very company she represented. The balancing act began to fracture her. Days bled into a frantic, exhausting cycle. During daylight hours, Elena sat in sterile conference rooms, managing media spin and assuring distraught families that James Harrison was genuinely committed to their well-being. She spoke of safety and integrity, while the chronic, searing pain in her left arm, a constant reminder of the physical cost of survival, seemed to intensify with every corporate assurance she delivered. She kept her elbow locked, resting her arm flat against the mahogany tables, biting back the hiss of pain that threatened to betray her professional facade. At night, the mask dropped. The Martinez apartment became a cramped war room. Elena spread out Marcos's ancient police reports, insurance claims, and autopsy documentation across the kitchen table, illuminated by a single, harsh lamp. The material she'd collected was fragmented, but one detail remained chillingly consistent. The failure in Marcos's case had been traced back to prematurely cured concrete, supplied by a fly-by-night firm called Apex Construction. Elena needed to know if Apex Construction had touched the new medical center. Since James had locked down the internal procurement files, Elena had to find an external route. She started by leveraging her professional clearance. Armed with her community liaison identification, she spent 2 furtive evenings at the town's planning and zoning archives. She didn't look for Harrison records. She looked for Apex Construction records, digging through city permits, historical zoning variances, and local supply chain documentation from the last 2 decades. The search was slow, painstaking, and emotionally draining. Every mention of a corner cut, every cheap material substituted, felt like a fresh wound inflicted on her husband. On the third night, she found it. A list of approved large-scale materials vendors for the entire Harrison Medical Center project, submitted to the town council during the initial permitting phase. Listed under the name of Westbridge Materials' primary sub-supplier was a shell company recently registered to an executive address downtown. Following the paper trail of ownership led her back to a holding corporation whose history was short, aggressive, and deeply familiar. It was the successor entity of the defunct Apex Construction. The ghost had a new suit, but the corruption was the same. The knowledge hit her with a sick wave of certainty. James Harrison was either employing the very firm that had murdered her husband, or he was so shielded by corporate layers that he was clueless. She decided to revisit the injured worker, Carlos. He was recovering in a private room at St. Jude's, a luxury paid for by Harrison Enterprises. Elena entered the room carrying a small bag of tamales, not corporate documents. Carlos's leg was immobilized, and his face was pale, but the recognition in his eyes was immediate and sharp. "They told me you were watching the room," Carlos whispered, his eyes flicking nervously toward the closed door. "The Harrison people. They made me sign a statement saying it was worker error, that a beam wasn't properly secured." "Did you sign it?" Elena asked gently, sitting beside his bed. "What choice did I have? I need the medical bills paid." "But it's a lie, Elena. I know what I saw. The concrete looked weak, and when the inspectors came through 2 weeks ago, they only checked the surface. They were laughing. I heard them talking about getting a bonus." "Who were the inspectors?" "I don't know their names. But the foreman who signed off on the delivery, he was nervous. He said the materials were substandard, that they'd been pressured to accept the load because the main supplier was threatening to walk if they didn't use their preferred sub. He named the supplier. It was Apex." Elena leaned in, her breath catching. Did he say who was applying the pressure? Who inside Harrison Enterprises let Apex Construction back in the door? Carlos hesitated, pulling the blanket higher. The raw fear was palpable. The foreman said, "He said the order came down from the executive floor. He didn't name James Harrison, but he said it was someone high up, someone who handles the real estate acquisition and financing, someone who has been there for years, before Mr. Harrison took over." Before Mr. Harrison took over. The implication was chilling. The rot that killed Marcos wasn't just a new mistake. It was an ingrained legacy of corruption, a cancer festering at the core of Harrison Enterprises. And James, in his rush to redeem his family name, might be enabling the very people who carried out his father's dirtiest work. Elena thanked Carlos, promising to protect him, though she felt utterly exposed herself. She knew the next step was suicidal. She had to get inside the procurement office, past James's corporate walls, and find the digital paper trail that led from Apex Construction straight to the complicit executive's desk. That night, she waited until midnight. Dressed in dark clothes and carrying the large, professional-looking portfolio she used for her community work, she took the freight elevator up to the 20th floor of Harrison Tower. Security was sparse late at night, focused mainly on perimeter surveillance. She used her community liaison card, which granted her after-hours access only to her small, shared office, and followed the procedure she had meticulously observed over the last 3 months. She scanned her card at the executive floor gate. The light flashed green. She walked past the sleeping reception desk, her old work boots soundless on the plush carpet. She didn't go to her office. She headed straight for the restricted executive wing, where the procurement and acquisitions offices were located. She knew the codes were changed daily, but she also knew the weaknesses of corporate bureaucracy. Every executive employee had a temporary access override code for emergencies. She had watched James's chief of staff use the physical keypad several times. Taking a shaky breath, Elena held the portfolio in her aching left arm, using her right hand to quickly type a sequence she had memorized based on proximity to the security desk. 127900 The deadbolt clicked open. Silence. She slipped inside. The air was cold, scented faintly with expensive leather and stale ambition. Elena found the procurement manager's office. It was locked with a secondary key card. Futility threatened to drown her. She couldn't pick the lock. She couldn't risk setting off a silent alarm. She slumped against the wall, fighting the urge to rub her screaming arm, realizing she was defeated before she had even begun. Then, she remembered something James had mentioned during a casual luncheon 2 weeks ago, a detail about their digital archiving system. Harrison Enterprises had recently migrated its oldest files to a new, cloud-based platform. But the most sensitive files, including current acquisitions and ongoing litigation documents, were still being mirrored on a backup server housed on-site for redundancy. The server room was 2 floors down, in the basement level, known only to IT and senior management. Elena took the stairs down 2 flights, the silence amplifying the frantic rhythm of her heart. The basement was different, cold, echoing, and smelling of ozone and metal. She found the unmarked, heavily shielded door to the data core. It was a standard proximity lock, no keypad, but as the community liaison, she had been granted access to the building's internal directory, and she knew the IT manager's name and location. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a small metallic object, a simple, flat metal ruler she had borrowed from the diner's back office. It was a clumsy, desperate instrument, but years of living on the financial edge had taught her a crude form of security bypass. She slid the ruler into the gap between the door and the frame, probing gently for the access plate's release switch. Click. She pulled the heavy door open, revealing a cavernous room filled with the monotonous, powerful hum of thousands of spinning drives. Racks of servers stretched away into the darkness, flashing tiny hypnotic indicator lights. Elena found the main server terminal. She booted the interface, her mind racing. She didn't have a high-level access code, but she knew the protocol for external system maintenance. A temporary guest login issued to authorized external consultants. She typed in the generic username, Harrison Guest. A blank password field appeared. She tried the standard default, 11234566. Denied. She tried a date she knew was significant to James Harrison, the anniversary of his father's death. Denied. She tried community liaison. Denied. She leaned her forehead against the cool steel casing of the monitor, fighting back panic. Her arm was throbbing violently now, a spike of white-hot agony shooting down to her fingers. She was running out of time and luck. Suddenly, a memory surfaced. A casual comment James had made about simplifying the access for the new cloud technicians. He had mentioned using a single, secure phrase that everyone knew, but no one would guess. A word that encapsulated the company's new direction. She typed, "Redemption." The screen flashed. Access granted. Elena exhaled a shuddering breath and dived into the company network. She located the procurement archive, bypassing multiple internal firewalls, each click an act of corporate espionage. She drilled down into the Medical Center Phase 1 materials file. There it was, the purchase order, confirming the delivery of the faulty concrete. The supplier was indeed Apex Construction's shell company. But beside the supplier name was a second document, an internal memo marked Urgent Acquisition Review, Site 4. Elena clicked on the memo. It wasn't about concrete. It was about the property directly adjacent to the medical center. Land James had intended for future expansion. The memo detailed an aggressive, hostile bid placed on that land just weeks before the collapse, significantly inflating the cost and threatening to bottle up Harrison's entire expansion plan. The signature at the bottom of the hostile bid's correspondence was unmistakable, written in an arrogant, sprawling script. Victor Sterling, the ruthless real estate magnate, James Harrison's fiercest rival, was not just trying to outbid Harrison. He was positioning himself directly next to the collapsing structure. Elena felt a cold knot form in her stomach. Sterling's involvement made the structural failure less about historical negligence and more about cold, calculated sabotage. He had likely used the corrupt Apex construction as a proxy to cause the disaster. But why? Elena furiously scrolled through the rest of the memo, searching for the connection between the Sterling bid and Marcos's 13-year-old death. She saw a mention of a recent lawsuit Sterling had secretly resolved, involving structural integrity failures on a long-dormant property. She clicked the attachment. The old lawsuit detailed a massive cover-up, a corporate maneuver that had erased multiple liability trails, all focused on one entity, Apex Construction. Victor Sterling hadn't just used Apex. He had owned and operated them years ago. Shutting them down only after Marcos's death had made the firm too toxic to maintain. Victor Sterling hadn't just benefited from Marcos's death, he had orchestrated the entire cover-up. And now he was doing it again, to James Harrison. Elena was just about to download the full, unredacted corporate file on Sterling's past liabilities when the server room door, which she had thought secured, suddenly hissed open. A wave of light spilled onto the dark floor, and the heavy thud of footsteps echoed in the enclosed space. Who authorized access to the data core? A deep, unfamiliar voice demanded, echoing off the rows of silent servers. I have security on my comm. Identify yourself now. Elena froze, her hand hovering over the download button, the screen illuminating her terrified face. She recognized the voice. It was the head of risk management, a man who never left the 20th floor before 5 in the morning. He had found her. He was standing in the doorway, blocking her only exit, his silhouette massive and menacing against the hallway light, holding something metallic that glinted faintly. Her heart hammered against her ribs, the sound a roaring alarm in her own ears. If she ran, she lost the evidence. If she stayed, she lost everything. The high-pitched electronic whine of the servers provided a terrifying soundtrack to the standoff. Identify yourself, now! The voice of the head of risk management, Mark Denton, was a low, dangerous rumble. He took a heavy step toward Elena, the metallic object in his hand resolving into a formidable, industrial-grade flashlight, the beam blindingly focused on her face. Elena's heart hammered a frantic, desperate rhythm. She was exposed, caught in the act of theft on the 20th floor of Harrison Enterprises, miles from the community dignity she had carefully built. Her career, Maya's scholarship, their entire future, it was all condensed into the 20% progress bar displayed on the data core screen. She couldn't run. Not yet. Mr. Denton, I am Elena Martinez, community liaison, she said, forcing her voice to remain steady, relying on the inherent authority of her new position, however thin. There has been an emergency security vulnerability reported concerning the medical center supply chain. I was following standard protocol to confirm the breach. Standard protocol involves breaking into the locked data core at 4 in the morning, Denton countered, his tone laced with heavy skepticism. He took another step, his presence suffocating the small space. He was a man built like a concrete wall, and his eyes, visible above the intense light beam, were cold and calculating. She had only one shot. I have the authorization codes and logs on file, she lied smoothly, pointing to the screen where the download counter had just ticked up to 85%. I am documenting the system vulnerability. If you interfere, Mr. Denton, You are compromising the integrity of a high-priority corporate investigation personally authorized by Mr. Harrison." Denton froze. The lie was audacious, but the confidence in her voice, combined with the sheer gravity of a crisis that had injured several men, gave him pause. He was trained to mitigate risk, and accusing the community liaison of breaking protocol when she might actually be following a discreet, sea-level order was a larger risk than letting her finish. In that split second of hesitation, the screen flashed green. Download complete. Elena snatched the industrial-grade flash drive, shoved it deep into the pocket of her jeans, and met Denton's gaze with renewed defiance. "Report this incident immediately to Mr. Harrison," she instructed, walking past him briskly toward the exit, ignoring the throbbing agony now surging through her left arm. The pain was no longer chronic. It was acute, a screaming manifestation of the pressure and fear she had just endured. "Tell him I have secured the evidence and will submit my report by 7 o'clock this morning." Denton, stunned by her brazen exit and the implied threat of James Harrison's wrath, stood motionless. Elena didn't wait. She fled the 20th floor, the physical data, the truth, a searing weight in her pocket. She drove straight to Murphy's Diner, parking her dented sedan in the shadows behind the building. The diner was a familiar fortress, empty at this hour, allowing her the solitary security needed to review the files. She plugged the drive into the diner's old laptop, the screen flickering to life. She opened the spreadsheets marked Site Subcontractor Master List and cross-referenced them with the old police reports and insurance documents she had brought from the dusty box. The connection was immediate and sickeningly clear. The firm responsible for supplying the structurally compromised materials at the Harrison Medical Center construction site, the materials that had led to the catastrophic collapse, was a shell corporation named Sterling Development Materials. A wave of cold certainty washed over her, replacing the adrenaline. Sterling. Elena's fingers trembled as she searched the archival police records for Marcos's 13-year-old accident. The original incident report detailed negligence in the use of substandard concrete supports, leading to a fatal collapse. The report named the supply vendor as North Star Aggregates. She scrolled back to the Harrison Enterprises list and cross-referenced the corporate registration details for Sterling Development Materials. North Star Aggregates had been dissolved 8 years prior, only to have its assets, including specific regional distribution contracts, quietly acquired by a new holding company, Victor Sterling Holdings. Victor Sterling, the ruthless rival developer, was not just trying to sabotage the medical center. He was doing it using the very corporate infrastructure, the same compromised supply chain that had killed Marcos years ago. The realization hit her like a physical impact, stealing the air from her lungs. This wasn't just corporate negligence, it was cyclical, weaponized corruption. James Harrison's Savior Project had, inadvertently or deliberately, placed the town in the hands of Marcos's killer. As the corporate names swam before her eyes, the pain in her left arm intensified. It was beyond a simple ache. It felt like her muscles were tearing, every nerve ending screaming in protest. She gripped the edge of the diner booth, focusing on the rough laminate surface, trying to compartmentalize the excruciating, burning sensation. She had suppressed this injury for so long, but the sudden weight of 13 years of unresolved grief and terror had finally snapped her physical resistance. Suddenly, the old cell phone she used only for work emergencies shrieked, slicing through the tense silence of the diner. It was the incoming call alarm, a panicked, unknown number. She fumbled for the device, answering with a strained, breathy, "Hello? Ms. Martinez, this is Dr. Reyes from the University Medical Center." The doctor's voice was clipped, professional, and chillingly serious. "We have your daughter, Maya, here. She collapsed about an hour ago during her final anatomy exam. We need you to come in immediately." There was an acute reaction, severe cardiac distress, and dehydration. She appears to have ingested a cocktail of highly potent, unregulated stimulants. The corporate betrayal, the discovery of Victor Sterling's deadly historical link, all of it dissolved instantly. The world narrowed down to the stark, terrifying fragility of her daughter, Maya, her brilliant, dedicated daughter who had succumbed to the desperate pressure of the dream, pushing her body past its breaking point with dangerous drugs. Elena dropped the phone, the clatter echoing off the empty floor. The fear for her daughter was a cold, complete terror that eclipsed even the years of grief for Marcos. The two crises, the external corruption destroying the town's future, and the internal fragility dismantling her family, had collided with devastating force. While Elena raced across town to the hospital, James Harrison was locked in his penthouse office, the lights of the city reflecting the paranoia on his face. The internal structural engineering report lay open on his massive mahogany desk. It confirmed his worst suspicions. The collapse was not due to substandard materials alone, but specifically timed charges placed on foundation supports and tampered rebar connections. It was sabotage, surgical and costly, designed to look like an accident. James had known Sterling was capable of aggression, but this was calculated violence. He activated a secure internal forensics program, cross-referencing recent internal communications with access logs for the construction site blueprints. The results were instantaneous and catastrophic. The executive responsible for signing off on all recent security clearances and receiving advanced architectural revisions was none other than David Wells, his chief operating officer, a man who had served the Harrison family for 20 years. Wells had been feeding Victor Sterling precise construction data for months. The ultimate betrayal was a silent, festering cancer within his own walls. James leaned back, physically sickened. Wells was the conduit. Sterling was the executioner. The realization explained the strange delays, the inflated material costs, the inexplicable friction in the company culture. He immediately initiated a security lockdown on all Wells's accounts and contacted his legal team to prepare for a swift, brutal removal. But the corporate damage was only starting. As James prepared for the internal bloodbath, his personal assistant, Diana, buzzed through, her voice frantic. "Mr. Harrison, switch to any local news channel, immediately. It's Victor Sterling. He's holding an unscheduled press conference on the steps of City Hall. He's using the construction collapse and a new incident at the university." James snatched the remote. On the screen, Victor Sterling, immaculate in a gray silk suit, stood before a phalanx of microphones, his expression one of sanctimonious concern. "This tragedy at the Harrison Medical Center is a clear indicator of corporate negligence," Sterling declared, his voice ringing with false sincerity. "They promised safety. They delivered collapse. They promised prosperity. They delivered injury. And now we see the true cost of this predatory takeover, even in the halls of their own charity, a scholarship recipient driven to the brink by the impossible pressure of their expectations, collapsing under the weight of this flawed empire." James felt a surge of ice-cold rage. Sterling was weaponizing Maya's collapse, her private health crisis, using it as political fodder to smear the integrity of the Harrison Foundation and the entire project. He was connecting the failure of the building directly to the failure of the scholarship. It was a masterstroke of predatory public relations. Just as James was reaching for the secure line to call his PR firm to mitigate the unfolding disaster, his office phone rang. The caller ID was listed simply as Murphy's Diner, Elena Martinez. He answered, his voice tight with controlled fury. "Elena, I'm glad you called. We have a serious problem. Sterling is exploiting the collapse and—" He didn't finish. "Don't talk to me about Sterling, James. Elena's voice cut across his, strained and raw, fueled by sleepless rage and agonizing physical pain. I know exactly who he is, and I know what he did 13 years ago. The subcontractor, the cheap concrete, the cover-up that killed my husband, Marcos. It's all there, James, in the documents I found tonight. The same infrastructure that brought down your site, James, is the same infrastructure that built your family's fortune on the bones of mine. She paused, taking a shuddering breath that sounded dangerously close to a sob. You tell me now, James. Tell me the truth. Were you naive enough to let Sterling back in? Or did your father teach you how to bury the evidence yourself? The accusation hung between them, a chasm of mistrust opening up just as James realized he needed her most. He had just discovered the traitor within his organization, the architect of his immediate crisis. But Elena, dealing with Maya's internal collapse and armed with evidence of historical corporate murder, believed he was the source of all her pain, the very enemy she had been seeking for over a decade. James looked at the news screen, then at the damning report exposing David Wells. He had to explain the sabotage, the mole, the whole truth, before Elena destroyed them both with her misplaced vengeance. But he was too late. Before he could speak, before he could offer a single defense, the line went dead. Elena had disconnected, leaving him suspended between internal betrayal and external accusation, completely isolated, just as Victor Sterling's public campaign of destruction was hitting its peak. Part 4. The Judgment Day. The accusation hung between them, a chasm of mistrust opening up just as James Harrison realized he needed Elena Martinez most. He had just discovered the traitor within his organization, the architect of his immediate crisis. But Elena, dealing with Maya's internal collapse and armed with evidence of historical corporate murder, believed he was the source of all her pain, the very enemy she had been seeking for over a decade. James looked at the news screen, then at the damning report exposing David Wells. He had to explain the sabotage, the mole, the whole truth, before Elena destroyed them both with her misplaced vengeance. But he was too late. Before he could speak, before he could offer a single defense, the line went dead. Elena had disconnected, leaving him suspended between internal betrayal and external accusation, completely isolated just as Victor Sterling's public campaign of destruction was hitting its peak. Scene 1. The Mole. James Harrison slammed the phone down onto the glass desk, the sound a thin, sharp echo of his shattered composure. He felt a sudden, profound nausea. Elena thinks I'm the enemy. That realization hurt more than the structural integrity report. He spun, his eyes focusing on the secure internal drive glowing red on his desktop, the undeniable evidence of David Wells's prolonged betrayal. The executive vice president of development, Wells, had been leaking critical project timelines and, worse, had deliberately overridden safety checks, allowing the historically corrupt contractor tied to Sterling to use substandard materials during the foundational pour. Wells had been James's father's man, a fixture in the old guard of Harrison Enterprises, loyal, James had thought, to the legacy. He realized now that Wells was loyal only to the aggressive, ruthless methods of the past, seeing James's philanthropic redemption as weakness. He found David Wells in his plush corner office, calmly reviewing documents, the picture of insulated corporate ease. "David," James said, his voice dangerously low, stripped of its usual cultivated warmth. Wells looked up, his expression shifting from genial patience to a flicker of cunning realization. "James, bad timing. I'm reviewing the legal strategy for the site collapse. We need to focus on liability deflection." "Stop!" James cut him off, walking forward and placing the 3-inch stack of Wells's internal communications onto the desk. The damning record of digital meetings with Sterling's shell company representatives. "You facilitated the collapse. You compromised the safety protocols. You have spent the last 6 months feeding Victor Sterling our proprietary information. Wells leaned back, folding his hands over his vest, a faint, chilling smile playing on his lips. He did not deny it. He looked utterly unafraid, even superior. "It was necessary, James," Wells drawled, his voice a polished, confident rumble. "You've gone soft. This whole medical center as community savior nonsense? It was costing us billions in margin. Victor understands how the game is played. You buy low, you build fast, and you move the profits offshore. Your father understood that." James felt a cold dread settle in his stomach. "My father never deliberately put lives at risk." Wells chuckled, a dry, brittle sound. "Didn't he? Who do you think cleared the paperwork for that infrastructure project 13 years ago? The one where a few local contractors had an unfortunate accident with faulty equipment? We streamlined the process, James. That's business. Sterling offered me a 51% controlling interest in the new infrastructure trust once he bought you out. You should have stuck to hedge funds." The word struck James like physical blows. 13 years ago. An unfortunate accident. Marcos Martinez. Wells's arrogance, his calm confirmation of years of entrenched corporate evil, solidified James's desperate need for Elena's trust. "This runs deeper than I thought. My father was involved. Marcos's death wasn't just negligence. It was organized cost-cutting." "You're finished, David," James snarled, reaching for the physical evidence. "I have the files. Your communications are archived. You are going to prison." "Am I?" Wells raised one eyebrow, the smugness radiating off him. "I have a copy of those files, James. I already sent them to Sterling. They implicate you as the CEO who failed to oversee his own executives. They show negligence. And right now, Sterling is waiting for the public narrative to solidify. He's about to give a press conference. He's going to use the collapse, the structural failure, and the little matter of your scholarship students' academic meltdown to prove you are an exploitative predator. You're too late." James froze. Maya. Sterling was going to weaponize Maya's burnout and hospitalization as proof of Harrison Enterprises' callous demands on the community. Before James could call security, Wells made his move, not toward James, but toward a hidden safe beneath his desk. In 3 swift, practiced seconds, he pulled out a thick, leather-bound folder. "You want evidence, James? I'll give you evidence," Wells sneered, clutching the folder. "This contains the hard documentation of every payout, every silenced contractor, every corner cut since 1998. It's my insurance policy. And if you try to stop me, this goes public, and the Harrison name doesn't just lose a medical center, it loses everything." Neat. Wells bolted for the door, forcing James to make an impossible choice: secure the evidence proving the structural sabotage, or pursue Wells and the insurance file that contained the truth of the last 2 decades. James cursed, but the choice was easy. Wells was the deeper threat. James grabbed the stack of digital evidence and sprinted after the traitor, hitting the panic button on his internal security system just as Wells vanished into the emergency stairwell. Sartutuis. Scene 2. The breaking point. Elena was not answering James's persistent calls. She was 18 blocks away, standing in the cramped, airless storage closet of the old Murphy's Diner, her temporary sanctum of quiet desperation. The grief over Maya's collapse had been quickly submerged by the raging certainty that Victor Sterling and, by association, James Harrison, were responsible not just for her current anxiety, but for the fundamental trauma of her life. Maya was fragile, hospitalized, clinging to a thread of consciousness after her system crash. The doctor had been blunt: severe stimulant abuse mixed with extreme exhaustion. The pressure of the scholarship, the weight of Elena's ambition, the crushing schedule. It had broken her daughter, and Elena, in her desperation for upward mobility, had missed every sign. Now, Elena sat hunched over the dusty box containing Marcus's life, police reports, blurry photographs, and the critical documents she had managed to pry out of a sympathetic former insurance agent years ago. She had proof. The same shell company that Wells's internal files mentioned, Nexus Concrete Services, was the one Marcos had flagged as dangerously substandard during his final months. Sterling owned Nexus. Sterling was behind the past death and the current collapse. And James, as the current CEO, was shielding the entire operation. A searing, blinding pain shot up Elena's left arm, the result of decades of lifting and serving, compounded by the adrenaline and grief of the last 48 hours. She gasped, dropping the folder. The chronic pain had escalated. It felt like her tendons were snapping. She clutched the injured limb, tears of pure agony blurring her vision. No, not now. I won't be stopped. She looked at the newspaper clipping detailing Marcus's funeral, then at the photo of Maya, tiny and smiling, pinned to her nursing student ID. She was done being the victim, done waiting for justice. Victor Sterling was scheduled to deliver a televised address from the steps of City Hall, a calculated spectacle designed to maximize the damage to Harrison Enterprises. Sterling was not just going to leverage the site collapse. Elena knew he was going to leverage Maya, twisting her suffering into a metaphor for Harrison's corporate toxicity. Elena stuffed the crucial documents, the Nexus contract details, and Marcos's final testimony, into the inner pocket of her black work jacket. She didn't know how she would get through the security perimeter, or if the media would listen, but she had to confront the source of 13 years of torment. If James wouldn't expose the truth, she would burn the whole town down herself. Ignoring the throbbing agony in her arm and the desperate voice of caution, Elena walked out of the diner closet, emerging into the fluorescent light with the grim resolve of an avenging angel. Scene 3. The Showdown. The plaza outside City Hall was a chaotic tangle of news vans, spotlights, and security personnel. Victor Sterling stood at a prepared podium, radiating power and manufactured righteousness, his face perfectly framed by the logos of the city's 3 major news networks. And so, we must ask ourselves, Sterling intoned, his voice booming with affected compassion. What cost does Harrison Enterprises' reckless pursuit of profit exact? It is not just the 5 men severely injured in the collapse. It is the very soul of this community. A community that Harrison promised to uplift. But instead, they exploit its most vulnerable. He paused for effect, then delivered the blow Elena knew was coming. We have learned that even the scholarship programs, meant to foster local talent, are merely a facade for corporate pressure. A young woman, a nursing student, Maya Martinez, is currently hospitalized, suffering from complete systemic burnout. An 18-year-old child, broken by the impossible demands of this corporation's vanity project. When Harrison Enterprises speaks of community, they mean compliant, exhausted pawns. Elena watched the broadcast feed on a news truck monitor, her blood turning to ice. Sterling had found her daughter's weakness and weaponized it with surgical precision. This was her moment. James was nowhere to be seen, likely holed up in his ivory tower dealing with the mole. Elena was alone, armed only with paper and decades of suppressed rage. She pushed past a startled security guard, ignoring the shouts of media access only. Her black jacket and severe expression gave her an authoritative air she didn't possess. She moved with a terrible, focused momentum, her eyes locked on Sterling. Sterling saw her instantly. His expression flickered, from supreme confidence to stark recognition. He knew Elena was the widow. He knew the connection and the implied danger she represented. "Sir, sir, we have an uninvited guest." A guard rushed toward Elena. Elena shoved the guard aside with a surge of adrenaline, ignoring the flash of blinding pain in her arm. She reached the steps just as Sterling attempted to conclude his speech with a damning summary. "And I promise this town, Harrison will not escape accountability. Justice will be served." "Justice?" Elena's voice sliced through the microphone's feedback, loud and raw. Every camera swung instantly toward her. Victor Sterling, caught mid-triumph, was suddenly framed against the backdrop of an intensely grieving woman. Elena reached into her jacket and pulled out the old, yellowed document, the Nexus Concrete contract. She held it high, shaking slightly. "Justice was denied 13 years ago," Elena shouted, her voice thick with pure vengeance. "And it was denied by Victor Sterling. This man didn't just sabotage the medical center, he murdered my husband." The media frenzy was instantaneous. Reporters surged forward, shouting questions. Sterling's composure cracked, his face contorted into pure animal fury. "Get that woman out of here! She's mentally unstable!" Sterling roared into the microphone, attempting to drown her out. "The subcontractor for the collapsed concrete is the same one that cut corners on the I-97 overpass," Elena pressed, ignoring the guards closing in. "Nexus Concrete, owned by Victor Sterling. Ask him about Marcos Martinez. Ask him who signed off on the faulty rebar and the contaminated mix." The words, Marcos Martinez and murder, hung in the electrified air. Just as the security team tackled Elena, attempting to wrest the documents from her hand, a sleek black sedan barreled around the corner of City Hall, tires squealing against the wet asphalt. It was James Harrison. He had abandoned the hunt for Wells, realizing the immediate, catastrophic danger Elena faced. He saw her struggling with the guards, saw the cameras flashing, and saw Victor Sterling's triumphant, murderous glare. James realized Sterling would not just discredit her. He might silence her permanently. James slammed the car into park, leaping out and running toward the steps, desperate to reach Elena before she could be completely engulfed. But someone else had reached her first. From the edge of the crowd, concealed until the moment of maximum chaos, a hulking figure emerged. The man wasn't a guard. He was too quick, too focused. He grabbed Elena from behind, his massive hand clamping over her mouth, suffocating her desperate cry. He wasn't trying to escort her away. He was taking her. The man was David Wells, the traitor, holding the leather-bound insurance folder in his left hand, dragging Elena, the living embodiment of James's redemption and Sterling's past sins, toward the shadows of a nearby alleyway. James saw the kidnapping unfold in horrifying slow motion. Wells had leveraged the chaos of the press conference to neutralize the two people who could destroy him and Sterling simultaneously. Elena thrashed, trying to bite Wells's hand, struggling to hold onto the documents, but the pain in her arm gave out completely. A sickening pop echoed in her wrist as she used it to brace against Wells's grip. She felt the documents slip from her fingers, fluttering down to the feet of the horrified reporters. James screamed her name, sprinting toward the alleyway. But Wells was already pulling Elena out of the range of the flashing lights. James realized he had lost the physical proof, he had lost the traitor, and now he was about to lose the only person who understood the full depth of the corporate conspiracy. He reached the mouth of the alley just in time to see Wells shove Elena roughly into the back of an unmarked black van, sealing the heavy door behind her. Wells jumped into the driver's seat. James lunged, reaching for the back of the van, but he was too slow. The tires burned rubber, sending up a cloud of toxic white smoke that swallowed the frantic lights of the media circus. James stood alone, choking on the exhaust fumes, watching the taillights vanish into the night. The deafening silence of the media flashbulbs now focused solely on him. Elena was gone. Abducted by the man who had facilitated the site collapse, in league with the man who had orchestrated Marcos's death, James was left completely exposed, standing alone amidst the wreckage of his project, his reputation, and the total annihilation of Elena's quest for justice, unable to save the woman who had just risked everything to save his community. The smoke from the tires of the vanishing van was a burning white shroud, temporarily blinding James Harrison. He stood rigid, the humiliation of the public failure surpassed only by the sheer, paralyzing terror of Elena's abduction. She was gone, seized by a brutal operative working for the man who was actively destroying James's life, and who, Elena had just risked everything to expose, was linked to the death of her husband, Marcos, years before. James snapped into action. Corporate panic replaced personal shame. He wasn't just losing a project. He was losing the last sliver of his genuine purpose. "Track that vehicle!" James roared into his private secure line, his voice echoing over the chaotic din of retreating news crews and police tape. "I want satellite, traffic cameras, everything. Find her now." Within 7 minutes, James was back in the sterile silence of his executive floor, his gaze locked on the closed circuit feeds streaming across a custom-built digital wall. The van was traced to an unused industrial park on the outskirts of the county, property discreetly owned by a labyrinthine holding company known to funnel funds into Victor Sterling's less savory operations. But tracking the van wasn't enough. The abduction had occurred too smoothly, too precisely. Sterling had known exactly where Elena would be, when she would speak, and the route her security detail, James's security detail, would take. James wheeled away from the screen, his eyes narrowing on the one man conspicuously absent from the crisis room. Garrett Thorne, the chief operating officer, a man who had served James's father loyally for 3 decades. James burst into Garrett's office. The room was dark, but the COO was hunched over his mahogany desk, bathed in the cool light of a single monitor. He wasn't working on the crisis. He was finalizing a transaction. "Where is Elena?" James demanded, his voice dangerously low. Garrett Thorne jumped, then quickly masked his surprise with a practiced sneer. "Mr. Harrison, I'm finalizing damage control reports for the board. I had no idea you'd be down here." "You knew where she was going," James pressed, walking around the desk until he was leaning over the panicked man. "You changed the security briefing 10 minutes before the press conference. You rerouted her vehicle through a choke point." Garrett's composure finally fractured. "It was business, James. Pure business. Sterling offered a better deal. A full buyout of the land after your spectacular failure. He guaranteed I'd keep my position, that we would keep the profit margin this company was built on. Your father understood profit. You're too soft, too focused on philanthropy." James felt a cold, final certainty settle over him. The betrayal was complete, institutional, and rooted in the very legacy he had been trying to redeem. "You facilitated a felony abduction," James stated, retrieving the secure phone. Garrett, realizing his future was being dictated by the CEO's thumb on a dial, lunged for the computer. James reacted instantly, grabbing the COO's arm and slamming the man back into his expensive chair. Garrett's flailing hand knocked a folder to the floor. It was a contingency report. Among the heavily redacted internal memos about the structural collapse was a copy of an old liability release form, the exact damning document Elena had been desperately trying to track down, showing the discounted inferior materials authorized for use years ago at the site where Marcos Martinez died. The document had been signed off on by Garrett Thorne. "You covered it up," James whispered, his disgust profound. "All of it. 13 years ago. And you were doing it again." Within the hour, Garrett Thorne was detained by Harrison Enterprises security detail, and James had every detail of the abduction site. He radioed his best security team, bypassing local police who were currently overwhelmed by Sterling's manufactured media crisis. James was going himself. Elena was held in a cavernous, concrete space that smelled of ozone and forgotten industry. Her left arm, ravaged by the sustained anxiety and the physical shove from her abductor, was throbbing with a dull, persistent agony she had learned to treat as white noise. Her captor, a thick-necked man named Doyle, was impatient. He paced the floor, occasionally kicking a rusty support beam. "Where are the papers, Elena?" Doyle snarled, his eyes glinting under the sparse industrial lighting. "Sterling knows you have them. The documents linking the old construction company to his new shell core. Give them up, and this ends now." Elena, tied securely to a metal folding chair, met his gaze with unyielding defiance. She had survived far worse threats than this, threats packaged in overdue bills and eviction notices. Doyle was predictable. The paperwork wasn't here. She had only told James where the evidence was stored in case she didn't make it to the press conference. "I don't know what you're talking about," Elena lied, tasting the metallic tang of fear. Doyle laughed, a harsh, grating sound. He reached into her jacket pocket, pulling out her communal outreach notebook. He flipped through the pages, finding the scribbled notes about regional suppliers, the code words for the cheap concrete, and the names of the injured workers. "Don't waste my time, Martinez," Doyle said, tearing the notebook in half. "You think you can take down Victor Sterling with scribbles and whispers?" Just as Doyle raised his hand, intending to strike her, the main door burst inward with the force of a battering ram. 3 security agents, 2 armed, 1 carrying a breaching shield, poured into the room, followed immediately by James Harrison. James's face was a mask of grim determination. He saw Elena, bound and terrified, and the immense, suppressed rage he had carried since his father's death finally detonated. "Release her," James ordered, his voice echoing in the vast space. Doyle, stunned by the speed of the intrusion, drew a small, illegal firearm. James's lead security agent didn't hesitate, tackling Doyle with a speed honed by years of executive protection. The gun discharged, the bullet embedding itself in the ceiling with a sound like a firecracker. In the ensuing struggle, James rushed directly to Elena. He quickly cut her restraints, his hands steady despite the adrenaline pumping through him. "Are you hurt, Elena?" Elena shook her head, trying to reorient herself, the pain in her arm spiking sharply now that the danger was past. "Maya! I need to see Maya." "I've handled Maya," James promised, lifting her gently. "We're leaving. Now." They drove directly to the hospital. Not the emergency room where Elena had been taken, but the wing dedicated to student health services where Maya was recovering. Elena found her daughter pale, hooked up to an IV drip, but sitting up, talking quietly to the university dean of student welfare. The relief that washed over Elena was so potent it threatened to buckle her knees. She rushed to Maya, enveloping her daughter in a fierce hug. "I'm so sorry, Mama," Maya whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I failed. I crashed. The stimulants. I couldn't keep up." The dean, a severe woman named Ms. Caldwell, cleared her throat. "Ms. Martinez, your daughter was found with several non-prescription aids. The reliance on these substances, coupled with exhaustion, constitutes a serious violation of the academic charter, particularly given the Harrison Scholarship's terms regarding wellness." Elena felt the crushing weight of impending academic expulsion, the shattering of the dream Maya had fought so hard for. But before Elena could argue, James stepped forward, his corporate persona fully reasserted, but now layered with genuine compassion. "Ms. Caldwell, I believe there are extenuating circumstances," James interjected smoothly. "Maya Martinez is a brilliant, dedicated student. However, the pressure placed upon her, the pressure the community has placed upon her as a symbol of our scholarship's success, is immense. He then pulled out his executive phone, displaying an official internal memo detailing the systemic corporate corruption that had just led to Elena's abduction and the catastrophic collapse of the medical center site. My company, which funds Ms. Martinez's scholarship, has been actively engaged in rooting out deeply entrenched systemic corruption. This stress, this instability, directly impacted Elena, and by extension, Maya. We are not asking for a pass, Dean. We are requesting a temporary medical leave of absence, complete with mandated counseling and therapeutic resources, which the Harrison Foundation will fully fund. Maya did not fail. She burned out under impossible external strain. Ms. Caldwell, visibly flustered by the CEO's personal involvement and the seriousness of the documented corruption, conceded. Maya was placed on academic probation, but the scholarship and her future remained intact, provided she committed fully to her recovery. Elena watched James secure Maya's future, not with money, but with the ruthless application of truth, and realized her initial suspicion of his involvement was completely unfounded. He wasn't the cover-up. He was the primary victim of his own company's inertia. Hours later, the sun was rising over the scarred landscape of the city. James and Elena sat in his office, no longer employer and employee, but survivors united by a shared enemy and a mutual tragedy. The cost of their victory was staggering. Garrett Thorne was in custody, his complicity in both the site collapse and Elena's abduction documented and undeniable. But the collateral damage was equally vast. Sterling is winning the public war, James admitted, running a hand through his perpetually neat hair. He's using Maya's health scare, framing it as a symptom of the exploitative Harrison work culture, and the site collapse as proof that my supposed philanthropy is just corporate negligence in disguise. Construction is completely paralyzed. Even if we prove sabotage, the environmental and structural cleanup will cost hundreds of millions and take months. Elena opened her worn leather bag and carefully pulled out a sealed plastic envelope. Inside were the original yellowed documents she had stored years ago, the official paper trail that detailed the regional supplier who cut corners on Marcos's site. "This is it, James," she said, pushing the envelope across the polished desk. "The evidence I was trying to present. Marcos's accident 13 years ago. The supplier, Sterling Concrete Holdings, was a shell corporation then. I know Sterling is meticulous about covering his tracks, but if he was using the same method, the same paper trail, he would have repeated it on this site." James picked up the documents, his corporate instincts immediately recognizing the value of the legal paper trail. He didn't just see proof of negligence. He saw proof of a pattern of predatory, fraudulent corporate activity stretching back over a decade. Thorne ensured the connection between Sterling Concrete Holdings and the new subcontractors was seamless, James realized, tapping the documents. "We have the internal records of sabotage, the testimony of the injured workers, and now, Elena, we have the history. The deep, documented history of corporate malfeasance that links Sterling directly to the death of your husband." The air in the room was thick with the weight of potential justice. They had the evidence, the pieces of a puzzle spanning 13 years, but Victor Sterling was still free, publicly triumphant, and shielded by a massive media campaign that had successfully demonized James Harrison. "Sterling knows we have the historical link now," Elena pointed out, rubbing her aching arm. "He won't wait for us to go through the legal channels. He will use every resource to crush us before we can make this public." James looked down at the documents, then up at Elena, the woman who had refused to break, who had gone from a quiet widow fighting to survive to the singular force that exposed the rot at the heart of his company. "He is expecting us to fold, Elena," James said, a dangerous new intensity in his voice. "He has taken everything from us. Your justice, my redemption, Maya's peace. He has won the first round, but now we are going to fight him with every single resource at our disposal. We are going to expose him publicly, legally, and permanently. James pushed his chair back, rising to face the sunrise. The task before them was monumental, taking down one of the most powerful and ruthless men in the state. We need to bring this evidence to the federal authorities before Sterling can silence the witnesses and destroy the remaining documentation, James declared. But we can't just walk in with a file. We need an angle. We need to hit him where he least expects it. He turned to Elena, his face illuminated by the morning light, revealing a deep resolve. Elena, the public sees me as the villain now, but they trust you. You are the community. If we present this together, we have a chance. Are you ready to go to war? Elena met his gaze, the remnants of fear banished by the cold, clear focus of vengeance. He took Marcos from me 13 years ago, Elena confirmed, her voice utterly steady. I am ready, James. Tell me what we do first. Tell me how we start the fire that burns him to the ground. Because right now, he is planning his next move. And we have to assume that move involves ensuring we never speak again. He took Marcos from me 13 years ago, Elena confirmed, her voice utterly steady. I am ready, James. Tell me what we do first. Tell me how we start the fire that burns him to the ground. Because right now, he is planning his next move. And we have to assume that move involves ensuring we never speak again. The planning session that followed was not a corporate meeting. It was a pact forged in the crucible of shared vengeance and necessary survival. Elena, armed with the brittle paper trail of Marcos's past, insurance claim denials, police reports that conveniently evaporated, and the desperate scribbled testimony of the injured worker, provided the local proof that linked Victor Sterling's shell companies directly to the shoddy materials used over a decade ago. It was the motive James needed. James, in turn, used his access to the vast digital architecture of Harrison Enterprises. He had already identified the internal mole, Arthur Finch, the chief operations officer, a man his father had trusted implicitly, and a man James had foolishly failed to scrutinize. Finch had been feeding Sterling proprietary site data, allowing the rival magnate to precisely time the sabotage and subsequent media blitz. Their trap was simple, elegant, and lethal. They leaked a false, highly technical memo about a planned structural change to a secondary site. A memo that only Finch would receive and only Sterling would immediately recognize as a vulnerability. Less than 24 hours later, Sterling's company initiated a hostile, panicked lawsuit against Harrison Enterprises, citing the exact and entirely fabricated structural weakness mentioned in the internal memo. Finch was cornered, his betrayal laid bare by the digital footprint of his communication with Sterling's legal team. James handled the internal cleansing with cold, precise efficiency, a stark departure from the naive philanthropist of months past. Finch was escorted from the building, his career and reputation instantly vaporized, giving James the crucial control he needed over his own company. With the corporate infection removed, James could finally focus on the immediate, terrifying personal crisis. Elena walked into Maya's small, sterile hospital room, a quiet mercy granted by the Harrison Health Network, carrying not anger, but profound, agonizing guilt. Maya, pale and fragile, was staring out the window, the IV stand next to her a visual confirmation of her failure. "Mom," Maya whispered, her voice cracking. "The scholarship. I'm sorry. I pushed too hard. It's all gone." Elena sat on the edge of the bed and gently took her daughter's hand. For the first time in months, she saw not the accomplished college student, but the vulnerable child trying to hold the entire world on her shoulders. "Nothing is gone, Mija," Elena said, fighting back tears. The dream is still here. You just needed to stop running so fast. E2, James had utilized his influence to secure Maya a medical leave of absence, citing severe exhaustion exacerbated by undiagnosed stress, a softer term for the stimulant dependency. The foundation insisted she take the full semester off for recovery and therapeutic help, promising her full reinstatement in the fall. "We're going to get you help, Maya," Elena promised, tracing the lines of worry on her daughter's brow. "We're going to slow down. We have each other. That is more stable than any concrete foundation or any scholarship." As Elena held Maya, she felt the familiar sharp ache in her own arm, a phantom echo of her own relentless striving. She realized that by hiding her own pain and pushing herself to impossible limits, she had inadvertently taught Maya the same destructive lesson, that success required silently suffering until collapse. The weight of that realization was heavier than any construction beam. They had both survived, but only by finally acknowledging their shared fragility. Justice, Elena discovered, was not a quiet, private relief. It was a seismic, public upheaval. 2 days after Finch's expulsion, James and Elena stood side by side at a press conference organized in front of the shuttered construction site. James spoke first, owning the failures of his corporate structure and announcing the comprehensive safety overhaul. He was contrite, professional, and devastatingly honest. Then, Elena Martinez stepped forward. She was not dressed in corporate attire, but in a simple, dignified dress that symbolized her connection to the town. The camera lights glared, and the reporters leaned in, expecting the community liaison to offer platitudes. Instead, Elena pulled out the thick folder of documents she had compiled, the evidence of 13 years of lies. "My husband, Marcos Martinez, died because corners were cut on a construction project," Elena began, her voice ringing clear and steady, amplified by the microphones. "Today, this center nearly collapsed for the exact same reason, orchestrated by the exact same corrupt interest. This was not an accident. This was an act of corporate terrorism carried out by Victor Sterling." She didn't speak of grief or victimhood. She spoke of facts. She presented the evidence, the traceable flow of funds from Sterling's holding company to the defunct subcontractor linked to Marcos's death, the deliberate use of cheap, unstable materials, and the recent communications provided by James that showed Sterling gloating over the project's ruin. Elena's public accusation, a furious, undeniable cry for justice from a grieving widow who was now a powerful corporate partner, shattered Sterling's control over the narrative. The community, who had begun to turn against Harrison Enterprises, rallied instantly behind Elena. The ensuing legal firestorm was swift. Based on the documented history of negligence provided by Elena and the proven criminal sabotage provided by James, Victor Sterling was indicted on multiple counts, his reputation utterly destroyed, his assets frozen, and his political allies scattering like startled pigeons. Marcos Martinez finally had justice. The cold, suppressive grief that had lived inside Elena for over a decade began, impossibly, to melt away. The Harrison Medical Center project resumed 3 months later. The scaffolding was new, the safety protocols meticulous, and the foundational concrete was poured under the watchful, hyper-vigilant eyes of independent monitors. The air around the site, once thick with tension and dust, now hummed with the energetic confidence of true rebuilding. Elena no longer needed to split her shifts. She remained the community liaison, but her role had evolved. She and James now ran the Harrison Foundation's community operations as genuine, equal partners. Their offices were separated only by a shared, glass-walled conference room. Their connection was built on shared trauma, mutual respect, and the fierce knowledge of what it took to dismantle corruption. One late autumn afternoon, Elena found James watching the construction from his 20th floor window. "They're ahead of schedule on the north wing," James noted, turning to her. He no longer looked haunted. He looked humbled, stronger. "We beat him, Elena. But it was only possible because you never stopped fighting for Marcos." Elena leaned against the glass, the setting sun casting a long, warm shadow across the floor. Her arms still ached sometimes, a dull, chronic throb, but now the pain felt less like a secret punishment and more like a reminder of her resilience. "We beat him because you learned to trust the people on the ground, James," she countered, a small, genuine smile curving her lips. "You stopped trying to be the savior and started being the ally." They had done more than save the medical center. They had transformed their purpose. Harrison Enterprises was no longer an aggressive corporate legacy. It was a genuine instrument of community renewal, policed by the very people it served. Maya, meanwhile, was thriving in her semester off. She had started volunteering at a local clinic, channeling her nursing passion into practical community work without the impossible pressure of academic perfection. She and Elena now approached life with open honesty, acknowledging limits and asking for help, a radical new strength for both of them. Elena stepped away from the window, the setting sun catching the confident clarity in her eyes. The past was no longer a weight dragging her down. It was the foundation upon which her family and her town were finally beginning to build something real. James Harrison looked at Elena Martinez, not as a beneficiary or an employee, but as his most critical partner, a force of undeniable, dignified power. He knew their fight was far from over. The forces of greed and cynicism never truly retreated. But now he knew exactly who he wanted standing beside him for the long war ahead. He met her gaze, a profound sense of shared destiny settling between them. "Ready for the foundation meeting tomorrow, Elena?" he asked. "Always, James," she replied, reaching across the conference table to slide a stack of community proposals toward him. Her hand steady, her focus unbreakable. The Harrison Medical Center continued its slow, sure ascent toward the sky, a towering monument to second chances, built not on cheap, unstable concrete, but on the hard-won, shared justice of a widow and a CEO. The town, once divided, watched it rise, knowing this time the foundation was solid, and the people holding the blueprints were standing shoulder to shoulder, utterly unafraid of what the future might bring.